Join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we come to you today and thankful for all the blessings you give us. Today we're talking about kids, the most precious gift we all get here on earth. Ask you to lead, guide, and direct us that we make the right decisions and we do the right thing in your sight. We ask this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
All right, I'm Brooks Coleman, Chair of the House Education Committee, and we're really happy today to be co-hosting this meeting. It's a very important topic that we're talking about, and we have some very impressive and important and informed people here to help us understand this issue, so we're excited about that. And I'm glad the House Education Committee is glad to be co-hosting this, and I'm going to turn this over to my partner, Any and Minnie, and here's Minnie.
Thank you, Chairman Coleman. I'm Lindsey Tippins. I chair the Senate Education Committee. I appreciate your attendance and your interest in this. I believe this is an issue that we're going to be seeing more of in the coming days as the legislation is dropped, and it'll be an informative time when we can learn more about this important bill in the history of our state and the future of our state. So thank you all for being here. We will not delay the proceedings. I want to call on Ms. Erin Hames from the Governor's Office. The Deputy Chief of Staff. I didn't see you, Erin. I'm sorry. If you would just come forward and introduce your presenters in the program.
We've got. That's all right. We're going to say, before we start now, we want to ask Erin if you're up, and is there anyone else you'd like to introduce from your office that's here today? We'd like to have them introduced. Thank you so much. And at this time, we're going to have one of the governor's floor leader from the House, Representative Christian Coomer, who will introduce our panel. We're going to introduce them all, and then we'll call them up one at a time to present.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee members for holding this important informational meeting. I was thinking if you're Eenie and he's Meanie, does that make me Miney Mo? Okay.
You're more.
All right. Well, I do want to introduce our four distinguished guests today who are all experts in the field that we're going to be discussing. I'm going to introduce each of them and ask them just to wave at you so you can identify them, and then I think we'll have each one come individually to speak to the committee. The first one is Mr. Paul Pastorek. He is a former Louisiana State School Superintendent. He served on the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education from 1996 to 2004 in the state of Louisiana. In 2007, he was appointed to the role of State School Superintendent, where he served until 2011. The Recovery School District, which passed the Louisiana legislature in 2003 and was expanded in 2005, is overseen and operated by the state superintendent. Under his leadership as superintendent, the state played a major role in rebuilding and turning around schools in New Orleans. That's Mr. Paul Pastorek. Second is Mr. Nirav Kingsland. He's over here in the corner. He's the former CEO of the New Schools for New Orleans, which is a nonprofit organization that partnered with RSD leaders to ensure that great educators were prepared to transform underperforming schools in New Orleans. New Schools for New Orleans operates independently but in close coordination with the RSD. The organization provided resources, training, and support to educators who started and expanded many of the city's highest performing educational organizations. That's Mr. Nirav Kingsland. Next is Mr. Kevin Huffman, who's also in the corner. Mr. Huffman is Bill Haslam appointed Mr. Huffman as the Commissioner of the Department of Education. In his role, Huffman oversaw the creation of Tennessee's Achievement School District. And that's Mr. Kevin Huffman. Finally, Mr. Sam Rauschenberg, who's also in the corner over here. Mr. Rauschenberg is the Deputy Director of Governor Nathan Deal's Office of Student Achievement. He previously served as a public school teacher in the Recovery School District in New Orleans, but as a native Georgian, Sam was attracted to New Orleans because of the education reform going on in that state. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. So we don't waste any time, give these presenters all the time we can. So, Paul, are you the first one? Okay, I'm going to ask you gentlemen, if you would, to come in and have a seat in the middle there. And we'll eventually have all of you there where we can ask questions. But I have to ask you, pull that mic close to you and just where we can hear, and you're ready to go, okay?
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, both Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committees. It's an honor to be here today, and I'm happy to talk to you about our experience in Louisiana. I have been a volunteer, started as a volunteer many years ago in public schools. I've been a lawyer as my professional career. I was appointed to the State Board of Education in 1996. We adopted an accountability plan in 1999, and it was designated as one of the more rigorous and more effective accountability plans for many years, as observed by the Pew Charitable Trust and Education Week. One of the aspects of the accountability plan was if schools failed to rise out of the bottom and were chronically low achieving, the school districts were required to reconstitute the school. The language that had been adopted by the legislature was not specific about what reconstitution meant. And for a number of years after 1999, we saw schools languish in this low achieving category, and reconstitutions as tried by districts were not successful. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans predominantly. The then governor of Louisiana, Governor Kathleen Blanco, a Democrat who herself was a teacher for many years before she became governor, made a pretty dramatic and bold and very courageous decision. She had been looking at the performance of schools in the city of New Orleans for many years, was very troubled by the performance there. And she made a decision that she would pursue legislation, in fact, a constitutional amendment, within months after Hurricane Katrina in the winter of 2005. And I think it was November of 2005. She put forth a constitutional amendment and enabling legislation, which expanded the Recovery School District. The Recovery School District had actually been started in 2003, again by legislation, but there was really no move on the part of the state to actually exercise the Recovery School District. There were two schools that had been placed in the Recovery School District before Hurricane Katrina. Both were charter schools. Both were in the city of New Orleans. They were converted to charter schools when they were placed into the Recovery School District. This was the extent of the effort. But when Governor Blanco made the decision to go forward with the legislation, she selected all of the low-achieving schools in the city of New Orleans. There were about 126 at the time, and about 107 were taken at one time. The schools were moved under state authority. The state superintendent of education was the ultimate authority for the Recovery School District. And the strategy that the Recovery School District had and was adopted by the governor is that we were going to pursue a different approach than state-type takeovers had pursued in the past. You may know, but we had certainly studied this quite a bit in Louisiana, that when a state came into a failing district and replaced the superintendent with a new superintendent, we really didn't see results in other states from the benefit of such a change. When states came in and removed boards of education, local school boards, we really didn't see results in other states that had that authority. So the governor was looking for a different tool, and it was a tool that really was not used anywhere else before. It was unique to what we were doing in Louisiana. But her theory behind this move was that we would be able to try dramatically different approaches to dealing with chronically and persistently low-achieving schools, and that we would remove many of the impediments that restrict local school districts from being able to deal with this. We would remove the impediment, which sometimes is represented by a school board. We'd remove the impediment, sometimes prevented by a collective bargaining agreement. We would allow for tenure to be eliminated for purposes of making these dramatic changes. Now, there were some people who thought that the approach should be that all schools that were placed in the Recovery School District should be charter schools. There were other people who were concerned about charter schools. There was no statutory requirement for charter schools or traditional schools. There was no preference stated in the statute. But the theory, the operating theory was we were going to remove restrictions and barriers, and we were going to empower the new leaders of these schools, and we were going to adopt a different strategy from the point of view of the Recovery School District. Instead of using a traditional command and control management model of a local school district, where the superintendent hires principals, manages the hiring and firing of employees, directs the finances of the school, and manages the curriculum and instruction at a district level, the Recovery School District would instead delegate the responsibility over these three important functions to the leaders of the schools. So we would delegate the handling of finances, of curriculum and instruction, and of hiring and firing to the school leader. And we believed that if we did this, the school leaders would be empowered, it would form a team, it would create an entrepreneurial attitude among the members of the school leadership and teaching force, and this entrepreneurial approach would result in better academic achievement for students. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the storm, you might imagine that taking almost 110 schools all at one time was a dramatically challenging problem. And in fact, the effort was in part subsidized by the state, and we were very challenged to be able to stand up an organization. Remember, this was after Katrina. And some of this story, I think, is an artifact to Louisiana and doesn't reappear in other examples, as you'll hear about Tennessee. But we began the effort at trying to find the best leaders and talent that we could possibly find to run these schools. I was then came on board in 2007, about 18 months after the storm. Governor Blanco identified her candidate. The State Board of Education appointed me. I served in that capacity during her remaining 1 year in office. And then when Governor Jindal came in, he endorsed my appointment, and I was reappointed by the board to serve for another 3.5 years. So during that 4.5-year period of time, from 2007 to 2011, we had to manage the handling of these many schools. Now, one of the strategies that we used was to form a nonprofit organization called New Schools for New Orleans. One of the things that we believed was that the state nor the district was very good at being able to identify the kind of talent with the quickness that we needed to have the talent, and would be able to ramp up operators of schools to take over these failing schools. So in cooperation with local community leaders and philanthropy, not much of it exists in Louisiana, but philanthropy from outside the state, New Schools for New Orleans was formed. And you'll hear from Nerev Kingsland, who worked with New Schools for New Orleans at its inception, and then later became the CEO, to understand how they helped build a pipeline of talent to support the taking over of these schools and the handling of them with a more empowered leadership strategy. Now, the New Schools for New Orleans became a very important part of this, but one of the biggest challenges I think we had was finding enough people to take the schools. So initially, we ran schools under the old model, and we began a charter process where we conducted RFPs, and we asked operators to come in to basically bid on the schools to operate them. We would identify the type of strategy that we were looking for in a school. If we were looking for a vocational school, if we were looking for an alternative school, we would put this out in an RFP, and we would get qualified people to come in and make offers on this. Now, originally, we did not start with the idea in mind that we would have all charter schools. My strategy, my belief was if we had traditional schools or charter schools, I was agnostic about which one we would prefer. Rather, I would prefer the one that had the best chance of success and either had a clear track record of performance with other schools or had individual educators who offered a program of work, though new, may have given us the greatest promise for success. Now, we made a lot of decisions early on, and we were very careful in the kinds of schools that we brought on board. And we worked very closely with New Schools for New Orleans in the work that they did. And in the end, when I left in 2010, we had made substantial progress. I have a document here that I've handed out to you. This is a dated document. It's a little out of date. It's called The Urgency of Now, and it's basically a score sheet on the Recovery School District as of about 2010. The reason why I wanted to give you this document, even though it is dated in its information, and Neerav will give you some more updated information, is I wanted to demonstrate the speed by which we were able to see improvement in academic achievement in essentially the same population of kids in the city of New Orleans. And if you look on page 2, you can see in the middle of the page, the percentage of students at grade level had increased significantly. The number of seats that were in high-quality schools had also increased. And I want to draw your attention to something that I think is quite interesting, and it's on page 5. Because I just want to make this point that the power of the Recovery School District in Louisiana is not just on the schools themselves that were placed in the Recovery School District and were acted upon. If you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see a chart about the progress and growth of the Recovery School District. You'll also see on there progress and growth of the Orleans Parish School Board, and you'll see general progress of the state as a whole with respect to academic achievement. Now, the point I want to make here is that the state took most of the schools out of the control of the Orleans Parish School Board, but left the best schools with the Orleans Parish School Board, about 17 schools. And these schools actually improved at a rate greater than the state rate of improvement you can see by this chart as of 2010. So part of the objective here on the part of the governor, Governor Blanco and Governor Jindal when he took over, was not only to take the schools and put them into a specialized organization that would become expert in handling chronically low achieving schools, but it would relieve the local school district from the pressure of handling low achieving schools so it could do better with the schools that remained. And this is evidence of that occurring. Another interesting piece of leverage, I think, that the Recovery School District created for us in Louisiana is that when academic achievement went up very dramatically, as is shown in this booklet, the neighboring school district, Jefferson Parish School Board, which is the largest metropolitan community neighboring New Orleans, became concerned as a community. They were concerned that their school district, which was considered a D school district, D as in dog, would be eclipsed by the performance of the Recovery School District and the schools in New Orleans. And this would have been a humiliation to that community, because New Orleans was notorious for having such low academic achievement, and woe be it to any neighboring school district to actually be worse than New Orleans. The community rose up, elected a new school board, hired a new superintendent, and that district moved from a D as in dog school district to B as in boy school district in 2 years. And they basically followed the same strategy that had been adopted in the Recovery School District schools. That is to say, they reduced the size of their central office, they empowered their principals to do the work, and they held them to high levels of accountability. And the principals performed. Now, I would say that this also had some powerful effects on other school districts in the state. The tools at the state's disposal were not just the placement of schools in the Recovery School District, but it was also the threat of taking over schools in other school districts. And when superintendents knew that they were at risk, they were able to go to their school boards and make some really hard decisions about their schools that were difficult otherwise for them to make. And I had any number of superintendents who I worked with to use the power of the Recovery School District tool and the potential for takeover to help them be able to make some important changes in their schools. So I would say to you that this is a tremendous tool. I wouldn't necessarily say the tool should be created the same way as it was in Louisiana. You'll hear some differences in Tennessee, but the idea of the state approaching chronically low achieving schools and trying to build a specialty expertise to address these schools and to cause them to actually perform at much higher levels. Indeed, it not only has a benefit for those schools, but for other schools remaining in the state. So I was delighted when I heard Governor Deal announce his interest in the creating the Opportunity School District. I don't know what the details of that are, of that particular bill look like, but I think the concept sounds similar to us, and it was very compelling. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw.
All right, well, what we're going to do, if any of you feel you can't sit there without asking a question, I would let you. But the thing I would like to get everybody speaking, and then we'll have you on the panel. We'll all ask questions. Get our questions, because we want to try to get everybody in. And we have the presenters are spending about 15 minutes giving their overview. But if you need a question, I see there's 3 or 4 of you that. I'm going to turn you off, and then you can turn back on if you feel you got to ask a question. All right, next presenter then. Thank you so much, Paul Wilbrand. And that would be, I said, who's next? All right. Nerif, okay.
Thank you all so much for having me today. Here to talk about the New Orleans story, and I know every city is different, every state is different. By no means should you follow our path, but I hope there's some lessons to take from what we've gone through over the past 10 years. So in the early 2000s, before Katrina, a woman named Bridget attended a neighborhood high school in New Orleans. At that time in Louisiana, to graduate from high school, you had to pass 2 tests, a math test and a reading test. You could start taking these tests your sophomore year. You had up until your senior year to pass the test. So Bridget takes the test her first time, her sophomore year. She passes the reading exam and fails the math exam. She then goes on and she takes Algebra 2, Geometry, Pre-Calc, gets A's and B's in all her classes. And at the same time, she keeps on retaking the math sophomore exam. She keeps on failing it. Finally, it's her senior year. She goes to her guidance counselor, and she asks if she can drop a gym class to take a remedial math class, despite the fact that she'd already passed all her advanced classes. And her guidance counselor rejected her request. She then took the ACT and scored an 11. This put Bridget in the bottom 1% of test takers in the nation. At the time she scored an 11, she also happened to be the valedictorian of her New Orleans high school. She ended up not being able to walk across the stage with her classmates because she wasn't able to pass the math exam that only covered through 9th grade material. She had been fundamentally lied to her whole education experience. She'd been told she was on track. She'd been told she was career and college ready. And every time she took an objective measure of what she'd learned, she failed. And there were thousands of others like her in New Orleans. And I think why we're here today is the fear, and most likely the reality, that there's thousands of Bridgets in your state and in your cities as well. In New Orleans, our impetus for reform was in many ways a natural disaster. Hurricane Katrina hit our city. 80% of the city was underwater. Over 1,000 New Orleanians died. And the students who were most vulnerable suffered the most. They fled the city. They were often dislocated from their families. Most of them missed over a year of school. So in my mind, the New Orleans story is not a disaster story. It's not a Katrina story. It's really a testament about what's possible when kids of all races and all socioeconomic classes get a great educational opportunity. After Katrina hit, we did what you all are doing right now. We looked around the country and we said, okay, we do have a chance to rebuild our educational system. Who should we emulate? Who should we copy? I don't think it'll shock anybody in this room that in the richest nation in the world, there wasn't one functioning urban educational system that we could say was educating all students at a high level. Not one. So then we tried to ask, why is this? Why in the wealthiest country in the world is not one city system getting it done? And that was really an ideological puring experience for me. You know, a lot of people are for charter schools or for the teachers' unions. There's a ton of ideological divides in education, but I really came away feeling that most of the folks in the system were well-meaning. It wasn't the union's fault. It wasn't the school board's fault. It wasn't the superintendent's fault. It surely wasn't the families or students' fault. What our big takeaway was that it was the structure of the system itself. That you had these sclerotic bureaucracies that over time had not innovated, had not met the needs of the students and the increasing needs of kids walking in their schools. And so that was our takeaway. We weren't just going to change the math curriculum. We weren't just going to extend the school day. We weren't going to add an extra period of history. We were going to fundamentally change the structure of public education in our city. And the reason we were able to do that is because we had the Recovery School District legislation, as Paul mentioned. We had a state vehicle to intervene in the lowest performing school system in our state. And through the past 10 years, we've reinvented public education in our city. And it's a complicated governance model. We had a state takeover, as Paul mentioned. The local district still retains some of the schools. But at the end of the day, you can boil down what we've done into 3 principles. And I think those principles, to some extent, could be emulated in any city. The first principle is in New Orleans, educators themselves run the schools. It is educators in schools who call the shots. If a students are coming in December, there's mid-year transfers and they're behind at math, the principal doesn't need to go to the district to extend the math period or add in tutoring. This principal does not need to ask permission for any changes they want to make based on the needs in the classrooms and in their schools. Educators run the schools. Now, we've chosen in New Orleans to do this via charter schools, and I know that's a loaded word. At the end of the day, for me, a charter school is just a nonprofit organization that is run by a group of educators who are empowered to make decisions for the students in their building. In my mind, this is the ultimate form of local control, that educators themselves run the schools. The second principle is families have a choice. We don't think in New Orleans that your address should dictate what school you attend, nor should the government be able to say what school is best for your child based on what neighborhood you happen to live in. So we open up all the schools in the city to any family. The families can look at the list of all 90 schools. They rank them 1 through 7. They turn that into the district, and then they're assigned based on a lottery. Every family has equal access to every school in the city. It doesn't matter how big your house is, how nice your neighborhood is, what job you have. We have a purely equitable system. Anybody can attend any school. The third principle is really about equity and performance, and it's the role of government. This is still very much a public system, even though nonprofits run the schools. So the government has 2 main roles. It oversees the system for performance and makes sure the schools are delivering on the academic outcomes they said they would hit. And it oversees the school system for equity. An individual school can't make sure that the school down the street is serving special needs students, is not expelling too many students. So the government has an incredibly powerful role to make sure public tax dollars are spent well. So this is really the New Orleans system. Educators run the schools, families can choose where to send their kid to school, and government oversees the system to make sure our tax dollars are spent well. If you were designing a school system from scratch, it's a pretty intuitive way to do it. Let the educators run the schools, let families have choice, government make sure things are working. Right now, New Orleans is the only school system in our country that is structured on these principles. In terms of results, in 2005, if you would have force ranked all the school districts in the state of Louisiana, New Orleans would have been ranked at the 3rd percentile, basically at the bottom of the lowest performing state in our union. 10 years later, New Orleans is now at the 48th percentile. It's gone from the bottom of the state to the middle of the state in a decade. Now, to be clear, we have not yet got to the top of the state, and I think we can get there, but we've definitively proven that you can go from the bottom to average in a relatively short period of time. In 2005, 62% of New Orleans students attended failing schools. They woke up every morning and got on buses and went to schools that none of us would ever send our children to. Now in 2014, only 7% of children attend failing schools in New Orleans, and we're fairly sure in the next few years that'll be down to 0%, and not one student will have to attend a failing school in our city. Perhaps most importantly, when you think of equity, the students who had been underserved the most in our city, and I would argue in the nation, are now performing better than ever. In 2000, only 21% of African American students were on grade level in the city of New Orleans. In 2014, that number is up to 59%, and we're outpacing the state in terms of African American student achievement. We've also taken equity very, very seriously. I'll be the first to admit that not all charter schools in this country serve all special needs students, and some charter schools kick kids out. In our system, which is a predominantly charter school system, students with special needs are achieving at a higher rate than they've ever achieved in the past 2 decades, and our expulsion rate is actually lower than the state average. So we're serving some of the neediest students in the state, and we're keeping more of those kids in school every day. And we're now starting to see this, see the results at a high school and college level. In 2004, only 54% of New Orleans students graduated from high school. About 1 out of every 2 kids who started ended up with a high school degree. We've now got this up to 73%. In 2004, 45% of students attended college post-high school. This is now up to 58%. And lastly, in terms of data, while it was very difficult at the beginning to make bold change, as much work as you do with communities, change is very, very difficult, and you should be ready for that if you go down this route. But 10 years later, the polling and public support is at an all-time high. 72% of voters support the all-choice system. By a 2-to-1 margin, voters think the schools are getting better, and 82% of New Orleanians support the state intervention and have asked that it stay for another 2 years. A couple of closing notes, and I'll turn it over to my colleague in Tennessee. I stepped down from my role at New Schools for New Orleans in July and have spent the past 6 months traveling the country, working with other cities. And it's become very, very clear to me that this is not a New Orleans problem. It's a Chicago problem, it's a Newark problem, it's a Cleveland problem. It's an Atlanta problem, it's a DeKalb problem, it's a Macon problem. New Orleans suffered from Hurricane Katrina, but across the country there's a completely different storm of low expectations, indifference, and inaction. And at the bottom of this, I've come to believe, is the fact that most people in this country simply don't think that poor minority children can learn. They talk in code, and I'll hear people say these kids or those kids. And every time I hear them say these kids or those kids, I know what they're saying. They're saying these kids really can't learn, so why should we do anything? There's no responsibility for us to take action if it's an impossible task anyways. New Orleans has taken one small baby step to unend that myth that poor minority kids can't learn. I don't think our country is ever going to achieve its full potential unless other cities and states take the next big step. I think you have an incredible opportunity before you in Georgia, and I hope you're part of making our nation a better place. Thank you so much.
If you would, I have Senator Foy. I think you wanted to make a statement. If you want?
I'll at the appropriate time. I wanted to ask.
Oh, well, okay. I want to hear the other two speakers. You need to do it now.
I can ask what you know.
All right.
The main issue I wanted to ask about was funding, and because although we have not seen the bill, I think it's been embargoed up to this point. It hasn't been released.
Okay.
I know the media may have it, but we don't. But the question I have is in terms of funding.
Sure.
In my discussions here, there would not be additional. This is my understanding from being briefed that there would be a 3% takeaway from the local school allocation. That is 3%, and there would not be any money. How did y'all fund what you did? Where did the money come from? How much were your per student increases, if there were?
Yep.
Sure. I just want to understand better how you funded what you did.
Great. So we started from the fundamental principle that the taxpayer dollar belongs to the kid.
I see some other light. We're not going to take any more. We're going to take this one, then we're going to hear the other speakers, then we'll come back and let you ask all the questions. We want to get the other. Go ahead and finish this question, sir.
Great.
Answer that one.
And excited to dig in later. So we started with the idea that the tax dollar belongs to the children who's getting educated, both state and locally. So when the Recovery School District takes a school from a local district, the state dollar follows that kid and the local dollars are taken from the district and follow the child into the new school. So it's basically a one-to-one, money follows the kid. For an administrative fee, the Recovery School District took 3% of that total pot, the state and local combined, to run its administration, which we felt was fair. So money follows the child. The district takes a 3% cut.
Okay. Were there any additional funds used, and where did those additional funds come from?
A couple different places. So I'm not as familiar with Georgia. We were very fortunate in Louisiana to increase funding and at worst hold steady even through the worst of the recession. So from 2005 to 2015, the whole state saw funding increases, and the Recovery School District benefited from that. There was also some money set aside from the state itself. And then, as Paul mentioned, philanthropy really stepped up, both locally and nationally. And I do think there's an opportunity for that to happen in Georgia as well. I don't think that's long-term sustainable, but to get an effort like this off the ground, I think philanthropy can be a big support.
And I guess what I'm saying is, if not now, at some point, all of those dollars, I'd like to know where all those dollars came from, private, and otherwise per child.
Great.
That would be helpful, so we could see where you were and where we want to go.
Would be happy to do that.
All right, let's Bush, you need to. Very quick. All right, number 16, is that your?
Yes, sir.
All right, yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very quickly, point of clarification. The bill's not been embargoed. Frankly, we didn't want to release the bill. The governor's office didn't want to release the bill before this meeting as to distract from this meeting and our participation and our attention today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Thank you so much. We'll bring you back in just a second. Next presenter, I think it's going to be Kevin.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here. I, until about 3 weeks ago, served as the Commissioner of Education in Tennessee. And in that role, I oversaw the initial implementation of what we called the Achievement School District in Tennessee. And so we attempted to do what I think Georgia is doing now, which is learn from what had happened in Louisiana, try to figure out what lessons we could draw from, and figure out how to apply them in Tennessee. And the ASD was originally created in legislation in 2010. When I started in early 2011, though, the state had not yet actually taken any schools in. And so part of my task was to first hire a superintendent for the Achievement School District. And we actually hired a Georgian named Chris Barbic, who had run some of the most effective charter schools in the country in Texas, and got him to come and be our superintendent of the Achievement School District. The rationale for the Achievement School District was that Tennessee had many, many schools that had performed at an incredibly low level for a very long time, and nothing had happened that changed that level of performance. So when you looked at the bottom 5% of schools in Tennessee, and you looked at the bottom of the bottom 5% of schools in Tennessee, you saw schools where 10% of children were performing on grade level year after year after year. And when you looked at the bottom 5% of schools in the state, you saw that almost all of the children in those schools were low income and African American. In fact, about a quarter of the students in Tennessee are African American, but in the bottom 5% of schools, 93% of the students were African American, a situation that's so unacceptable that Governor Haslam, when he heard this, publicly said that this is immoral and we have to do something. So when we started, one of the first things we had to do was define eligibility for the schools. And we decided that we would define eligibility as the bottom 5% of schools in performance based on math, reading, and science scores over the previous 3 years. Relatively simple formula. Look at the percentage of kids that were passing the state assessment in math, reading, and science. All schools that had 3 years worth of data, rank order them. Bottom 5% were schools that were eligible to go into the ASD. And so in Tennessee, that's about 85 schools across the state. And most of those schools were in Memphis. So the first year that we ran the list, I think 69 out of the 85 schools were in Memphis, with a small number also in Nashville and in Chattanooga. We've since run that list one additional time, and because of the improvement in Memphis, there are fewer schools in Memphis, but it's still the dominant district that is on the list. We wanted to be sure that as we started the Achievement School District, we were building capacity slowly. So since we were building this from the ground up without a force like Hurricane Katrina that necessitated the state to rush in Louisiana, we were able to think about it slightly differently in terms of making sure that we had the capacity to run excellent schools for every school that we opened. So the first year that we opened 6 schools, and we had about 2,000 students, and that was in the 2012 and 13 school year. So this school year, it's 2 years later, we have 23 schools. We have about 7,000 students. We anticipate that 2 years from now, there will be about 40 schools in the Achievement School District with about 15,000 students. And we'll probably continue to open schools at about that rate, somewhere in the range of 6 to 10 new schools every year. And the constraint on the growth is making sure that we have people who are capable of running extremely high-performing schools for students in poverty, and that we have a sufficient number of outstanding teachers to go in and work in those schools. And so it's been, I think, a slower pace than we anticipated when we first passed the legislation. But we've had a commitment to quality over speed, and I think that's something that we feel pretty good about. One of the things that we also noticed when we looked at the lowest performing schools is that they tended to fall in feeder patterns. So even within Memphis or within Nashville, you would look and you would see, for instance, 3 elementary schools feeding 1 middle school, which fed 1 high school, and 4 out of those 5 schools, or all 5 of those schools, would be in the bottom 5%. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is think about the schools in feeder patterns and think about, can we take elementary schools in a feeder pattern first, and then take a middle school, and then take a high school in the same feeder pattern, so that we're really trying to address root issues, and we're not simply trying to put a Band-Aid on here and a Band-Aid on there. So that's been one of the things that we have been trying to do. We have community advisory boards that help us make decisions about which schools go in. One of the things about having 85 schools eligible, but only serving 25 or 30 schools and only bringing in 6 to 10 schools a year, you need a system for figuring out which of the eligible schools you are going to actually bring into the Achievement School District. And our ASD superintendent works with the local district superintendent and with the community advisory board to ask the question, of these schools, which are the schools that are the highest need, where we can add value? Which are the schools where there isn't a strong district plan in place right now to improve it? And can the ASD go into those schools? We then have a matching process. Most of our Achievement School District schools are run by charters, and we've attempted to recruit the highest performing charters both within Tennessee and throughout the country. So we've brought in some national charters that have a very strong track record in other states. And we've also asked our best charter schools in Tennessee to expand. So some of our homegrown charters that have a very strong record have expanded as well. And part of our process then is, once we identify the schools that we're going to bring in, into the district, we then have a matching process where we match them with the charters that have been authorized to work in the community. And again, that's a community engagement process where local community advisory boards are meeting the charters and learning about them, and we're trying to make a match between community needs and the charters that best fit that needs. We have been extremely focused on talent pipelines as part of this process. When the Achievement School District brings a school in, the biggest question that we have is, do we have a great principal, and do we have great teachers who are capable of ensuring that all kids learn in that environment? And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, that any state-led district has, is figuring out how to build that pipeline of great principals and great teachers. It's probably been the biggest constraint on growth that we have had in Tennessee. But I think working with the district, working with local universities, and working with outside providers, we have made some real inroads in ensuring that Memphis and the Achievement School District is a place where people want to come and teach and work. So our impact is, it's very early stage. We have only 6 schools that, as of the end of last year, had been through 2 years. Those schools did well. We have another 10 schools that are in their second year right now. We're very optimistic that those 10 plus the other 6 will all perform at a high level this year. In terms of growth, their overall achievement, it's going to take a number of years to get to the level that we want to see. But we measure them based on growth, and we expect that their growth will exceed the growth in other places in the state. So the early signs are promising, but I think it's early to judge because we have so few schools at this point in time. I will say we look at New Orleans and we think that is what we want. We want the schools in Memphis to improve faster than the schools in the rest of the state, which is what's happened in New Orleans. It's also interesting that parent demand has been quite high. In fact, it's been so high that the General Assembly is considering legislation that would allow schools to add students who are not currently zoned to those schools if their parents want them to go, because our schools are getting calls from parents who are saying, can my child go to the school? And right now the legislation is set up that only students who are zoned to the bottom 5% can go. But that's a very promising sign that a parent would call and say, even though this school historically was in the bottom 5%, I want my child to go there. So I think that's a sign of success as well. The other thing that I have seen is I have seen the districts change their practice as a result of the Achievement School District. In Memphis, the district created an innovation zone where they pulled schools in and created effectively an Achievement School District within their district and gave their schools more autonomy, more control of their funding, more flexibility. And the schools within their innovation zone have outperformed the rest of the schools in the district. That's very exciting. And I think having that sort of competition between the Achievement School District and the innovation zone only benefits parents and kids. In Nashville this year, they had more schools on the bottom 5% list than they had the previous time the list was run. And it spurred a very big conversation in Nashville about what they were going to do. And the district is now creating a turnaround corps of teachers to go in and work in low-performing schools in an effort to take it on themselves. I don't think these things would have happened in the absence of the Achievement School District. So I would close by saying, when I think about some of the lessons that we've learned, I think the competition has proven to be really good for kids and parents. I think it has spurred a level of innovation activity that didn't exist before. I think having flexibility on personnel is critical. The Achievement School District has significant flexibility in who it hires and who it keeps, and I think that is critically important. And the last thing I would say is capacity building takes time. I think when I started, I assumed that we would open 15 or 20 schools a year. We have not done that, and I think we've made the right choice in the pace that we've gone. But it takes time to build the pipelines that ensure you have a good principal and good teachers in every building. So I'll be excited to answer additional questions, Chairman, and thank you for having me.
We're going to have, I do have one question that I'll take, just one, and then I'll bring the last presenter. Then you can light the board up. So number 9, Senator Miller.
I'll wait till the next.
I appreciate that, Senator Miller. All right, last presenter, and that will be Sam. Hey, I'm going to take you first, Senator. Yes, sir. I'm going to turn you on first.
Thank you, Chairman Coleman and Chairman Tippins, for the opportunity to come speak for you today. I come to you as in my role at the Governor's Office of Student Achievement here in Georgia, but more importantly, as was mentioned, as a former teacher in the Recovery School District in New Orleans. Based on my time there, I have 2 main lessons that I want to get across to you today. The first is the importance of the Recovery School District in attracting talent to the city of New Orleans as a result of that reform. And second, as was alluded to earlier, the impact of community engagement and the success of that reform. So to give you some backstory, I grew up in Dalton, North Georgia, and graduated with a degree in economics from Georgia College. And during college, I got interested in education. And during my senior year, decided to pursue an alternative route in teaching. And I looked at options within the state, like the TAP program, but also looked at options out of state, like the Teach NOLA Fellows program in New Orleans. And ultimately, in the end, the significant reforms in New Orleans, as well as the significant demand for teachers at the time, were large factors in why I ultimately chose to leave Georgia and move to New Orleans to teach in 2007. So that gets to my first point. I'm not the only one that made that decision. There were a lot of people just in my Teach NOLA cohort that year that were not only recent college grads, but also career changers. We had a retired Army colonel. We had a Department of Defense teacher from Guam who moved to New Orleans for that. We had a 10-year lawyer who career changed. all of whom were unified around the desire to turn around the schools in New Orleans. And the reforms in New Orleans as well in Tennessee have had that same effect. So hopefully we'll be competing with them for talent. But in addition, many nonprofits, such as New Schools for New Orleans, Education Pioneers, leading educators sprung up in New Orleans surrounding that effort to provide support to the RSD schools. So that's my first point, the attraction of talent. So for 3 years, I taught in the Recovery School District taught high school math at Joseph S. Clark Senior High School, one of the direct-run non-charter schools at the time. It was an incredibly difficult but rewarding experience, as you can imagine. As was alluded to, new kids were moving back to the city almost daily, many of whom had been out of school for long periods of time, were multiple grade levels behind, and were dealing with losing all of their belongings and sometimes family members, much less being focused on school. So discipline was a challenge. And the RSD took over a lot of schools initially out of necessity because they had to guarantee seats for the students. So there wasn't time to really engage the community in a way that would have been effective. In reality, most people were more focused on rebuilding their homes, much less their schools. But prior to Katrina and after, Clark was one of the lowest performing schools in the state. So we had about 15% of kids that were on grade level in English and math. So to put a little life in that statistic for you, when I gave a diagnostic test to my 11th grade Algebra 2 students, my first year teaching, and it's supposed to be the last required math class in high school for these students, and about 7 out of 10 struggled with basic addition, multiplication, division, negative 2 plus 5 kind of thing. And we were supposed to cover quadratic equations by week 4. So it was had an uphill battle. So needless to say, it was a tremendous struggle. But while we made some gains over the course of my time there, the school had 3 principals over 4 years, and the leadership was unable to turn around the culture and the results of the school. But I should say that the abysmal performance at Clark had not always been the case. Clark actually, the alumni boasts many prominent African-American leaders in the city of New Orleans. There are city councilmen, pastors, university professors, musicians. Rebirth Brass Band, for example, is an example. Tons of influential people. So at the end of my 3rd year, when the RSC's accountability measures forced a conversation about the future of the school, many alumni jumped forward in opposition, concerned that their alma mater might be lost. But what they quickly realized, that the school that was so central to the African American community as well as their own past was not the same school that they were defending that day in 2010. So instead of growing opposition, they decided to form a community advisory group and engaged with a local nonprofit charter provider that had been successful with several other RSD schools. And they worked together, and through a series of meetings, they voted, actually, the community advisory group voted to approve this operator to take over Clark, which then the RSD authorized to happen. So in the following year, the school transitioned to be a charter with this organization, and actually the charter management organization added the president of the Clark Alumni Association to its charter board. So after 3 years since that has occurred, the school still has a long way to go. And I can't take any credit for that part. I was gone. I left in 2010. And I don't want to oversell the results, but the percentage of students who are at grade level has increased by 20 percentage points over that time. And more importantly, students are graduating and getting scholarships to college in ways that hadn't happened before. Because I can tell you that we had plenty of Bridgets from Neer's story that were at Clark. So this is no small feat, but I'm convinced that this progress would not have happened without community and alumni involvement, so that the reform could happen along with the community rather than to the community. So that's all I have right now.
Good. All right, what we're going to do, I'm going to ask our other panel members to come in. We have the 4 seats there, the 2 mics, if you'll spread them apart. And we're going to take questions. And as I promised, boy, I mean, this board looks like a Christmas tree. It is lighting up. All right, a lot of questions for you panel members, so I hope you're ready. I'm going to ask the members. You'll have 1 question, and then we'll come back to you to give everybody a chance. And please keep it in the form of a question, as I promised you, Senator Miller. Millar. Frick and Frat, as he always said. Yeah. Frick.
Mine will be a multi-part question. And I'm going to start with New Orleans.
Multiple choice.
I'm
All
going
right,
to start with New Orleans. It appears to me, and I'd like you to correct me if I'm wrong, that the reason this has worked for you is without the hammer from the state, this wouldn't be successful. And the reason I ask you that question is I've seen very few organizations that once they have power and authority, they want to give it up voluntarily until someone comes across and says, you will do this or else. Is that a fair assumption based on what's happened when you started out in New Orleans?
I think that is a fair assumption. I think, that when the state is ultimately counting on the districts to deliver the goods.
Pull your mics. Pull your mic right up there.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
All right,
How about this one?
That one's on.
All right. So I think the answer to your question is most definitely the state has to have a tool that ultimately delivers a consequence to school districts in this situation. When we adopted the charter school law, we could take charters out of business pretty easily. But under the traditional school system law,
Right.
you cannot. So this was a means to do that. Now, I will tell you that the object of the exercise was never to take over the school. The object of the exercise was to create a real incentive on the part of districts to make dramatic changes and to help them figure out how to overcome some of these impediments.
And the second part of my question was about, because I live in DeKalb County, which was mentioned earlier, and you said something about educators in New Orleans running the program, but I got the impression that nonprofits are created, and then they go out and probably hire, the nonprofit goes out and hires someone to run this, that has got expertise and a demonstrated track. Am I correct? So I don't care if it's for hire or not, if you're getting the results, but is that a fair assumption that when you create the nonprofit, even though you say educators are running the program, at the end of the day we bring in professionals that have a track record to hire and get this thing set up and running and going. Is that a fair statement?
It happened both ways. So in some
Okay.
cases, you'd see a community that would form a nonprofit organization, say, we want our school to be turned around. We'll form a board, incorporate, and then go out and do a search for a principal.
Okay.
In other cases, the educational entrepreneur that started the whole thing was a principal. So it might be somebody who's, kind of stuck in an AP position at a struggling school, has a vision. And those were the folks that our organization worked with the most. So if you had an idea for a great school, you would apply to us. We would give you about 1.5 years worth of funding
Okay.
to plan your school, visit schools across the country, build out your model, hire your team. So it happened in both ways.
In both ways, okay.
Yeah. I would say generally there was more success when the educator was the impetus for the school. And at the end of the day, it's about that school leader having a vision and building a team and board around that vision.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, pardon me for not knowing all the names there, who all was there. This is number 11. I'm not sure who's there. Okay? Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all the presenters being here. I've got a few technical points that I'll throw out, and anybody can comment, and some that are specific to New Orleans. I'm interested to know whether, in light of the hurricane tragedy, did the demographic mix of the student population change? That's specific to New Orleans. And in the process of going to open schools for anyone, how did you deal with the transportation issue? And then the last two things I'm interested in, how do you attract talent if you're not bringing in more money? And and how do you ensure testing integrity to show that, we've had a teaching moment in Atlanta and in other parts of Georgia about how much trust to put in the numbers. How do you ensure testing integrity?
That's a good one question. Good one question.
So on the first question of demographics, if you'll look on page 2 of the document I handed out, it shows that the demographics basically remain the same. There's some small adjustments, but the level of poverty, level of African Americans. Now, there's not a high limited English proficiency in New Orleans or in Louisiana. That's an oddity. But the demographics essentially remain the same. The second question was on transportation. So one of the big expense items in the city of New Orleans is transportation, because we allow any student to go to any school anywhere in the city. It is part of the raison d'etre behind the Recovery School District. So we incur a higher transportation cost than we would otherwise incur. We will transport kids across town. Then the last question.
Well, there were two.
Integrity of testing.
Integrity of the testing.
And attracting talent.
Attracting talent. I'll let Nirav talk about attracting talent. But on the integrity of testing, there are strategies that the state uses to try to smoke out any integrity issues, and there are numerous hotlines to report. There are erasure analyses that are undertaken, and I wouldn't say that anything is foolproof, but we have done investigations from time to time, have found evidence of cheating. This is in just generally speaking, but those have been relatively limited, and there's not been any peculiarity associated with the Recovery School District. So there are a number of steps that are taken to reduce the risk of that. And, Louisiana's had a pretty high stakes accountability system since 1999, and fortunately we haven't had any major issues with that.
In terms of talent, I would say think about it in probably two ways. One is there is a sense if you build it, they will come. I mean, that's the Sam story. And, think of how many times two teachers have had a beer and said, if only we could design our own school, if only we could make this different. Well, in New Orleans, the next day, those two teachers can come to an organization like ours and say, we have an idea to do this better. Will you support it? So I think that's one. There's just an organic kind of educator desire to be a part of something. The second is, we hustled. At New Schools for New Orleans, we raised a lot of philanthropy. I was crisscrossing the country, going to cities. To Sam's point, there weren't many folks who had built systems like this, and we wanted to tell people that if you wanted to be a part of something, come. And that isn't organic. It's not organic that somebody in Cleveland or New York or Chicago is going to come to New Orleans. That takes work. And we went out and did that, and it paid dividends. Our take was we wanted the best educators in the country in front of our kids. A lot of those were folks in New Orleans who got empowered, and some of those were folks who came down.
Let me just add one little piece to this. The oddity of New Orleans in terms of human capital attraction and bringing operators in is that we do not have a lot of national operators that have come. Almost all of the charters, with one exception, the KIP charter organization, almost all of the charters are grown in the state of Louisiana, in the city of New Orleans. And one of the really important points here that I'd like to draw to your attention is that really good principals who worked in the old Orleans Parish school system, who were restricted, restrained, and life was made difficult for them to be empowered, they became charter operators in the system, and they have become very successful. And in fact, we have a return policy. After 5 years, the State Board of Education will consider the return of schools back to the district. And we actually give schools the option of returning. They can select to stay in the Recovery School District or leave if they score high enough. If they do well, they're given the privilege of selecting. And one of those schools just selected to go back to the old Orleans Parish school system, a former Orleans Parish school principal, but now a charter management operator. And so it's very interesting in New Orleans. We did not have, though we had a lot of support philanthropically, we did not have a lot of outside people coming in, and yet we had talent that were able to take on this challenge.
All right, well, I'm being fair. I'm staying right in line as you turn your light on. All right, Representative Dudgeons. And then next will be Senator Fort, and then I'm going on down the line, 28, 27. We know where I am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll pretend to be a senator and ask a quick multi-part question. Question for the Tennessee folks, I'm interested in the number of schools who sort of fell in the failing area that we talked about, whether just the threat of this takeover. If you comment a little bit about how many systems you've seen moving in the right direction without doing that. So I'll ask that first question real quick.
So about we run the list every 3 years of the bottom 5%, and from the first time we ran the list to the second time we ran the list, somewhere close to half of the schools came off the list. Wow. And so most of those schools were not schools that were in the Achievement School District. Now, do I think that the being on the list and the threat of takeover played a role in it? I do. But it's hard to sort of disaggregate the data. Yeah.
Sure. And for either group, for teachers and principals displaced because they lost clearly people end up losing their jobs because of this who were there before and weren't doing the job. Did those people get absorbed back into other systems? Do they just leave education? Do you kind of know what kind of happened to that group?
I can tell you that in Tennessee, what happens is those teachers revert to whatever their school district rules are. Okay. So if they don't have tenure, and in Tennessee now there's a tenure system that requires you to have demonstrated quality in order to attain tenure. If you don't have tenure, then you can apply for jobs and so on. You don't have particular rights. If you do have tenure, then that invokes some rights for the system. And so some of them wind up staying in the school system and going to other schools. And some of them wind up leaving. And I don't know that in our 2 years of doing this that we have real data that shows how many have gone where. Of course, some of the teachers are hired by the people who are taking over. And I think pretty much every school that's taken over a bottom 5% school has retained some of the staff.
Okay. All right. Senator Ford.
And that is, for New Orleans in particular, it would be helpful if we knew state, local, federal, philanthropic funding that you received. You just said you were part of your job. I bet you spent a lot of time, 50% of your time or more, raising money. And so it would be helpful for us so we can know, compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. If you could provide us with that information, if you could tell us now, that's fine. But that's a request more so than a question.
Great. I'll get the hard data from you all, and I can follow up with the governor's team and make sure you have it.
That was a job offer.
And the only other question I have right now is the charter schools, were they private, were there for-profit charters, companies involved, were there organically created charters? Just what kind of mix are we talking about?
So the Louisiana law actually requires the institution that gets the charter from the state to be a nonprofit. So all the charters in the state of Louisiana are technically nonprofit operators. Now that nonprofit board has the option to contracting with a for-profit institution to manage that school, but they can fire that institution if it's not performing well. Kind of pragmatically and historically, in New Orleans, the boards that contracted with for-profits didn't do that well. I don't know what that says about the larger for-profit field or not, but just that was the case in New Orleans. Personally, I tend to care more about results, and if somebody's doing an awesome job, so be it. But for some reason or another, the pure nonprofits did better in New Orleans.
Okay. If I could. 28. Okay. Howard.
My question is, what tends to be the type of schools, whether elementary, middle, or high schools, that fell into the category of low performing and that came into the system, whether it was in New Orleans or Tennessee? Can answer that question. And second, part two of my question is, can you identify maybe one or two specific things that once the schools were in that achievement school system of what did they do? What was done different in those schools that's not being done in a regular traditional school now? We know we got issues in our some of our regular traditional schools, but what did they do different? Identify something that we could measure other than the test results that you're giving us data on. What did those principals, administrators, or teachers, were they charged to come up with, sending the kid to go work one day a week in a corporate, something, show us something that was different.
Thank you. I'll go quickly on Tennessee. In terms of elementary, middle, and high school, we set it up so that we ran the bottom 5% of each of those. And so we have a mix of schools that are eligible. Now, we did not bring in any high schools until this year, so it was just elementary and middle that we took on. But we ran the bottom 5% of elementary and the bottom 5% of middle and the bottom 5% of high schools separately. In terms of what schools have done differently, I'd point to three things. One is personnel flexibility. So they have the flexibility to bring in the principal that they want and to bring in the teachers that they want and to staff and support those teachers differently, which they typically don't have when they're with the district. Second thing is extended time, so extended time in the school day. So some of these schools are simply adding more minutes to the day. And the third, I would say, is funding flexibility. So I remember during our first year, the superintendent of the Achievement School District told the principals their Title I allocations for the year. So Title I, federal program, goes out on formula. But when these principals got their Title I allocations, they thought there was a mistake because historically the districts had taken so much money off the top before it hit the school, they couldn't believe there was actually that much money in their hands to spend when the district didn't get at it first. And so I'd say funding flexibility.
Yeah, and in Louisiana, there's not the same type of equal identification of bottom 5%, but the selection of schools ends up being indiscriminate as to whether it's early, elementary, junior high, or high school. So we have all three of those that will show up in the Recovery School District. So it's not just targeted at one type of school. In terms of the differences, I think what probably the best way to explain this, there are these differences that Kevin just described about the financial flexibility. But I think what is really going on here is that they begin to tailor the curriculum and instruction model to the kids that they're working with. And in a traditional school system, you tend to have a district-wide curriculum and instruction model. It is set forth from above. It is, we need to be here at this point in time. Now, not all districts are like that, and there are some flexibilities. But in this case, each school has the complete flexibility to adjust its curriculum, modulate its curriculum, emphasize, add time to the day. They have all of these flexibilities. Now, interestingly, some in Louisiana criticized the flexibility that the Recovery School District had and said we should be able to have flexibilities just like that. So the state adopted a law and said any district that wanted to be held accountable for outcomes could adopt these same flexibilities. As of the time, 2 years after, it was adopted 2 years before I left, it was not picked up on by any local school district. They didn't want that kind of accountability. But here you have people who are willing to take on that kind of accountability. And so they adapt, they do things differently, they have less overhead, they pay their teachers more, generally speaking. So all of these things compile together, the lesson plan, the program, the curriculum instruction model. You know, some of these things are targeted to kids who are VOTEC kids. Some of them are college. Some of them are IB. So you have this wide variability in the types of delivery that you have.
I have about 14 more people want to speak, so we have about 30, 40 more minutes. So let's try to keep our questions quick and go. We're going now with 27, 2, 6, and 20, so you know I'm not forgetting you. 27. Who are we? No, you can come back. You can come back. I can't let you. I'm sorry. We got to move on. I'll let you come back. All right. All right.
Okay, and I'll be brief, but if you cut my mic off, that's okay. I think I know my chairman. I think I heard this from Louisiana. I mean, I think that I heard this from Tennessee, but I didn't hear it from New Orleans. What is your criteria for selecting the schools as far as determining that they're failing schools? And of your 90 schools, how many were picked up by the ASD?
We have a little bit different approach in Louisiana. We have a level of proficiency that we expect. So it's not just 5% of schools that fall into this category. If the number of schools that fall below that proficiency level is so low, then they can be captured. It's coupled with a growth factor. So these combined factors of proficiency or growth. So we could have a lot of schools, we could have few schools. I don't know what the numbers are today. I'm not sure that we would have that, but I will tell you that there are more schools than are in the Recovery School District that are eligible for placement in the Recovery School District. But a number of these schools are under a different approach. So not all schools are brought in, but any school which is eligible will have to be treated with some dramatic change, though it may continue to reside with the local school district.
Okay, and if I could, how many did you have parents whose children were in schools that were identified as failing who opted to go to other schools that just said, I don't want to keep my kid in a school that's going into this recovery district, achievement district, and we're going elsewhere?
Yeah, families have choice at the end of any year to go to a different school. I'd say for the past 3 to 4 years, we see about a 50 to 70% re-enrollment rate. For us, it's every individual family needs to make a decision of whether they have faith in the new operator coming in. And sometimes they might want to wait a couple of years and go somewhere else, and that's their decision. And their
what do you mean by re-enrollment rate? 50 to 70 go back into the school that was an achievement?
Under a new operator. So a new group's coming in to run the school. The family can either re-enroll into that or choose a different school in the city.
Okay, and if I can, Mr. Chairman, last question. It's for both systems, and I was actually wondering why we didn't have Michigan here, but I don't know if they were invited. Was Michigan invited to?
No.
Okay, so so my question is
next week.
So for both systems, I'm curious how your superintendent was selected, and did that 3% carve out pay for that superintendent's salary? And I have more, but I'll stop.
No, that's good. Right.
Don't turn me off yet.
As superintendent in Louisiana, I was able to hire the superintendent of the Recovery School District, and I was also able to fire, and I was in control of the employees of the Recovery School District. And I know a little bit about Michigan, so I can answer some questions about that maybe.
Yeah, afterwards, we're going to have a little panel discussion afterwards. We can stay around as long as we want, because we're going to be here till 5 o'clock, our committee, so that'll be good. Y'all don't have to stay that long, but we'll. All right, number two, Representative Dixon.
Mr. Chairman, can Louisiana...
Praise the Lord, praise the Lord. Hey, you have to stay, Butch. All right, Pam.
I'd like to thank the panel for coming today. Thank you for all the information. There are a couple of questions. I'll try to, speed it up. First of all, I want to know if you have any data on the Jefferson Parish School District, and if they're in the schools that were in their recovery district. I'm very familiar with the schools in New Orleans. I graduated from the schools in New Orleans. And in 2005, Katrina hit August 29th. So there was not a full school year. So I'm trying to understand how you were taking your data from 2005 and comparing it, to now when the kids we couldn't even go back until October to even look at houses while we were there. So, I'm kind of interested in that. And also in terms of those schools those students who have choices to go to schools. You say they have choices to go to 9 schools. It's my understanding that even if they live within 5 miles of a school, they're not even able, some of them not even able to go to the schools within that district or, close to home. And so then they're traveling all the way across town. Say if they're coming from New Orleans East, going all the way to uptown New Orleans, off Napoleon Avenue someplace. And y'all know what I'm talking about. And I know Joseph S. Clark quite well.
So on the transportation, and whether they could go to neighborhood schools, a rule was adopted probably in about 2009 or 2010, which said that kids who lived in the neighborhood of the school would be able to go to that school up to 50% of the school population. So there were guaranteed seats for local neighborhood kids. In the beginning, there were no guaranteed seats for local neighborhood. That was your your second question, right? And your first question was?
I wanted the data on the Jefferson Parish schools. You talked about some of those schools decided to model their schools after New Orleans. I just wanted to see how many schools were basically like a recovery district. That would be, because Jefferson Parish is totally different, and you know the demographics in Jefferson Parish compared to Orleans Parish. When you talk, and this is New Orleans.
They're different, but they're not the same. I would agree with you. But there were no schools in Jefferson Parish that were in the recovery school district. And you asked about 2005.
Right, because we did not have a whole school year.
So
because
the data from 2005 is from the spring of 2005 test administration. So the hurricane occurred in August 2005, but the spring administration of tests was in March, and so that's the data that we're referring to when we say 2005.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Next we have, let's see, number 6. That's, all right, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I realize you don't know my name. I'm Senator Tate.
No, I do. I know you because I knew your father real well. He's a good friend of mine.
Just wanted to refresh your memory, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I actually have, I'm going to say 3 questions, all on ACT, but 2 that can be answered yes or no, if they don't want to be lengthy, and 1 that might take 50 words or less, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am, Senator Tate.
Okay. I'm going to start with the yes and no so we can get to the one that's a little lengthier. Basically, is it not true that 6% of the students in the New Orleans Recovery School District that only 6% received a sufficient score in English and math to attend 4-year college in Louisiana?
To receive the scholarship to attend 4-year colleges, yes.
Okay, thank you. That took more than yes and no. I appreciate it. Okay, next, isn't it true that the class average score for ACT was 16.4 for the New Orleans Recovery School District?
Yes.
Okay. And lastly, and this could be for either one or both, in recent data, the ACT scores in Louisiana and Tennessee are lower than the ACT scores in Georgia and in our nation as a whole. Can you explain your state's performance on the ACT and specifically how the recovery school districts performed on the ACT?
Sure. So I can start with the general ACT data, and thank you for raising it. So I think big picture, I want to be really, really clear about New Orleans' performance. In layman's terms, we've gone from maybe an F to a C-. It is not an excellent public school system yet. Now, I think there's very few school districts in the country that have made those kind of gains, but we're not excellent, and nobody should be under the impression that we are. So the recovery school district average right now is roughly around a 16, which is nowhere where we need to want it to be. If you would take those same schools and look at the 04-05 data, it was about a 14 average. So we've seen about 2 ACT score points over about 9 years, which on a scale of the ACT is actually pretty solid growth. I think most cities would be happy to see 2 points over the course of 8 or 9 years. The second caveat about that is about 2 years ago, Louisiana passed a policy that now requires all students to take the ACT. This was not the case pre-Katrina. So if you take the schools when we were scoring a 14, that was not with a high participation rate. we've skyrocketed our participation rate and gone up 2 points. So I would say there's been incredible success and growth in the ACT, but on an absolute level, we're not where we need to be yet.
For Tennessee, quickly, none of the ASD students have taken the ACT yet because we've just taken over high school, so they haven't participated. But just to defend the state's honor more broadly, I would note that Tennessee is behind Georgia on NAEP, which is considered the nation's report card. But during the last administration, we had the fastest growth in the history of NAEP. And if we do it again, we're coming after you.
Thank you, Senator Tate. All right. Let's go next to number 21, our wonderful chair of the Senate.
Prior to the takeover of the existing schools, was an analysis made of the schools to make a determination and define why the schools were failing?
I would say that I don't think there was an analysis in the sense of some evaluation, some major kind of study that was undertaken to do that, not in New Orleans, not that I'm aware of.
It's always been my opinion that not all schools fail for the same reasons, and I don't know that you've got a broad-based application on how you fix a failing school, and it looks to me like it needs to be more prescriptive to an individual school's needs. Y'all may differ with that. You've seen it firsthand. One of the concerns that I have, and I'll do one short follow-up in the takeover schools, is my concern that you deal with the same attendance zone with the same students in the same buildings with the same amount of money. Now, it's my understanding, I guess, after the hurricane, y'all did not have the same school buildings. Is that correct? Or did you reuse the prior building?
Many of the school buildings were damaged, but because we came back with a smaller population, we were using existing school buildings, but it was definitely a different landscape, no doubt about it.
But so the attendance zones were also shuffled as well, so you weren't dealing with the same children in the same schools.
The attendance zones were open citywide, so kids were going to different schools. You in your traditional attendance zone, if you're within a mile or two of the school, that's where you go. In New Orleans, those zones did not exist after the storm.
Okay, and one last question on the funding, and maybe I understand. Clarify for me on the allocation of the funding. Y'all are currently getting the average for the district in the school and not the amount that the school received prior to the takeover. Is that correct? Because you talked about the flexibility of the additional funding, so you're not, the takeover school did not have the same local funding the school had prior to the takeover. Is that correct?
It does have the same local funding.
Kevin, I thought you made, one of y'all made a comment on the right-hand side that the schools were amazed at the amount of flexibility, the amount of money that they had that they did not have before.
Right, that was on the federal funding. So in our zone, the Achievement School District gets the per pupil amount that is the district average per pupil amount, and it goes to the ASD, which then funds the schools. I think in the traditional district, what I was getting at is that federal funding is often used, it's used at the state level as well, and then at the district level to fund positions and staff and programs within the district rather than having it go directly to the schools, whereas the ASD is pushing most of that money directly to the schools. So there are different ways you can do this, and Tennessee's setup is different than the Recovery School District, but we do have zones. So we have, because we're taking over schools in districts that continue to exist, we don't have the sort of broad choice provisions in the same way that New Orleans does. And so when the Achievement School District takes over a school in Memphis, it takes over that school zone and has all of the students from that school zone attending it. So it is it's the same kids.
But going back to the funding, though, there was more money available in the school after it was taken over than it was prior to that because of the consolidation of district monies in the school. Is that correct?
There was more money, being pushed down to the school. So the pool of money was the same pool of money. It's just that there was more money
the amount
that
of
hit
money
the
per
school.
student in each school. It was greater after the takeover than before.
I think that's probably right.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's go where you'll know. Here's how you're coming. I have 5 more. 8, 18, 10, 11, 28, 27, and 2. So let's move it on. We'll stay here. We have another meeting starting at 8.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
New Orleans, I think you might have answered this, but the schools that you guys took over, and have some of those have progressed to the point where they could go back under the traditional system? Is that correct? And have any of them gone back, or they wanted to stay where they were?
I think the numbers are around 20 or 30 schools that are eligible for going back to the original school district. And I think one has definitively said they're going back just this year, and I think another may be deciding to go back.
Follow up. When they go back, sir, do they have to go back under the guidelines of the state or the traditional guidelines that were set up? Do they still have all the flexibility and maintain all the extras maybe that you guys have given them?
They are charter schools.
Okay.
And so they go back to the local school district as a charter school.
Okay. One other question, if you don't mind. Now, I got a question on some of the funding, too, because it appears y'all lost about 2/3 of your students when Katrina hit. Roughly 2/3 of y'all students didn't show up. So that is a tremendous amount of students, 40,000 students or so that you lost. And how did the funding shake out to you guys when you lost all the students? And I'm sure there was a tremendous amount of upheaval in funding and everything else, local funds and all that dried up. But did your funding per FTE go up at that period of time based on the loss of 40,000 students, or what happened there?
There was an increase because there was a special pot of money that was created by the federal government that was distributed to all districts that were affected in the state of Louisiana. It was probably 20 or 30 school districts in the state of Louisiana that got an additional aid package. That aid package lasted for about 2 years, and it was designed to replace a lot of items, especially school instructional items that were damaged or lost during Katrina. But that money has now all dissipated. It dissipated within the first 2 or 3 years. So now the district, now the Recovery School District receives the allotment that would otherwise be allocated for the local school district in which the school is located, because the Recovery School District is actually beyond New Orleans. There are schools in Baton Rouge and Shreveport as well. So they get, in effect, the local share, the federal share, and the state share on par with, pretty much on par with what the local school district gets. Yeah, that's right.
All right, number 18.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. You're on.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation today. And my question is pretty much along the same lines as the previous question. And understanding the Memphis story and the Tennessee story, I want to specifically ask the question is, how much do you think that the Katrina disaster contributed to the opportunity to rebuild the New Orleans school system from scratch? And my premises is that it's easier to build something new than to change something that already exists. And with the infusion of billions of extra dollars that wouldn't have traditionally been there, and people that would have traditionally opposed the recovery, how much do you think Katrina played to that, and how can an existing district, with all the folks still in place, could you expound on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the results in New Orleans and in the Recovery School District, at least in the first 2 or 3 years, are definitely an artifact or affected by Hurricane Katrina. And and some of the incredible injection of financial capital. So there were really two pieces of financial positive impacts that occurred. One was this $400 million that was distributed to 30 or 35 school districts in the state, but the lion's share of it went into the metropolitan area of New Orleans. And then the other piece was the rebuilding of schools because of the federal flood disaster money that came in. And so we basically have rebuilt many of the schools in the city of New Orleans. We've actually downsized the number of them. So two big financial things that happened. One was the $400 million distributed over the 30-so districts, and the other is about $1.5 billion to $1.8 billion that was for infrastructure and buildings. Now, beyond that, the district is, has long since been nursed off of those extra dollars. There's no doubt that there was a benefit achieved by that. But, in the last now 6, 7, how long has it been since Katrina? Almost 10 years since Katrina, you're still seeing, the positive impacts without respect to the injection of money that was received.
Just a quick follow-up.
If I can follow up on that.
We have about 20 more people now. We can't get them all. We have 15 minutes, so take your question. Everybody's going to have one, so take your second question. Make your questions and answers as quick as we can. We've got about 20 more people here. All right.
Respectfully, Mr. Chairman.
Yes,
thank
sir.
you. Understanding that you lost about maybe 2/3 of your students, which meant that you probably lost a lot of administrators, a lot of teachers. So it was probably easier for you to bring in a new influx of administrators and teachers, as opposed to already existing districts where people are there now. Could you talk to that just a little bit?
I think it's probably worth trying to hold two ideas about what it was like after Katrina. They're both important to understand, and I think this is why Memphis is important, because it's doing the same thing without a storm. First is what it did to the kids and families, especially those without wealth. Sam can talk about the kids he served right after the storm, but any educator I talked to had never seen levels of post-traumatic stress, mental illness issues, just anger, violence. New Orleans has historically, over the past 2 decades, usually been in the top 5 for murder rates in the nation. So you had one of the most violent cities in the country get washed away, family structures dissolved, miss a year of school. And so, to reverse it a little bit, if New Orleans was able to achieve these gains under those conditions, I would challenge any city, why not you? It's not going to get much harder than that in terms of what our kids and families went to. So that's one. On the other hand, yes, we had a chance to restructure, we had a chance to rebuild. There was natural turmoil that allowed for more entrepreneurship. And I think that's where you go to Kevin's point about pacing. We did 75% of the system in about 2 to 3 years. I think in a non-natural disaster situation, you're probably going to be at the 5-10 school a year period. So I think pacing would be different, but in some senses it should be easier, because I hope that families and kids have suffered a little less.
All right, that's, number 10.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us this afternoon for this discussion about a highly anticipated constitutional amendment, our second constitutional amendment in the last 3 years for education. I find it very interesting that much of the value in the recovery district concept comes in the form of flexibility. And I heard it mentioned that tailoring a curriculum to the needs of the students or perhaps the district or the community, flexibility with funding, accountability and incentives tied to accountability are all ideas that mirror much of what we have in Georgia with our charter system option. Our school districts were given 3 options: to remain status quo, choose IE square, or go to a charter system concept, which is fairly new and has been being rolled out in many districts around the state, Fulton County being the largest. So when we look at scale, I think there's an example. So my question for the governor's office would be, And dual enrollment is another program we have. You mentioned vocational training and a lot of that VOTEC and other options that the districts would have to prepare students for the workforce. My question would be, what are we offering? Where are we gaining? And why is this necessary when much of the value in what we would achieve through a recovery district is already being offered with some of our other options?
I'm happy to start on this. I'm familiar with it. The first time I heard about the charter district, I asked all these same questions. It's like, oh, they have a different model. What are the freedoms it entails? And the big takeaway for me, and when I reflect on our own experiences in New Orleans, the charter district is defining the relationship between the district and the state. It is saying the state has all this red tape, the district can get free of some of that. What a charter school is redefining the relationship between a school and the local district. And so I think both are fundamentally useful. I think you should have more autonomies in the district-state relationship, but I don't think they should be confused as the same thing, because a district could apply for charter district status, get these freedoms, but the day-to-day life on an educator in a school in that district could be the exact same. And it doesn't allow, those two teachers that have a vision to go start something, because the district is still the locus of power. It can just use those powers differently. So that was the big takeaway for me in thinking about the differences between these two systems.
All right. Let's go to number 19. Then in line we have 11, 28, 27, 21.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regarding Perkins federal funding for career and technical ag education, is there anything different or unique about it, or does it simply follow the same way it did with any public school?
In Louisiana, it follows the same way.
All right, 11.
Yes, my question, I guess, would be to the governor's representative. QBE was something that we had here in Georgia. There was a wonderful concept, but it was never fully funded. It was just cherry-picked as to what to fund. So over the years, we started having failing schools. And other things like cuts of up to $8 billion in Georgia's system over the past, 10, 12 years, contributed also to failing schools, and furloughs and shorter days in some counties. They increased the classroom sizes, dropouts increased, et cetera, et cetera. Also, charter school bill being passed has not had a chance to see if that's going to help the state of Georgia. Because we can't we can't assess the progress of it yet because it's just beginning. And also making schools decide whether they want to be charter or IE square and all of that. So now we have, who's going to identify the chronically failing schools and what's the root cause of them, and do we just need to, we're taking money away from the public school system rather than putting more in it, which seemed to be the reason that we were having the problems and the failing schools in the first place. So my question is, why would we go to the state taking over when we don't even know what's going to happen?
So I don't want to speak on behalf of the governor's office directly.
Use your mic, please, so that they can hear you.
Is this good?
Yeah, good.
I haven't been in all the conversations about the bill, but I will say that our agency has been part of the evaluation work for the Race to the Top work, much of which was to turn around low-performing schools. And the state received a significant infusion of money for low-achieving schools as well as school improvement grants from the federal government. And a lot of these schools got millions of dollars to do so. And our analysis, which is available on our website, showed that only a few of those schools have made some gains, but overall they've not made tremendous gains. And those schools had, the model that was chosen was a transformation model, which had very limited changes in the overall structure of the school relative to the other options. But there was a significant infusion of money into those schools over a 3-year period. So I would go to those as examples of schools that were low performing that have had a lot of resources to answer that part of your question.
Right. Thank you. Each guy.
Will they be able to say appeal school is failing, we want to take over your school, will they have an opportunity to appeal that if they feel that they are not a chronically failing school?
So I'll defer to what's going to be in the language in the bill, but I will say that the accountability system that has been used at the state level, the CCRPI, is put out by the State Department, and there's an appeals process they go through to make sure data is accurate, but the data is the data. So.
Right. They're going to stick around and we get through it. We can answer more of these questions. I want to get these last folks. We've got to get out of this room. 28. I said I'd come back to you, Representative Howard.
Thank you. Just a follow-up. Alternative schools. Do y'all have alternative schools in your system? And if so, how did you deal with those?
So in the RSD in Louisiana, we do have alternative schools, and we have providers who come in and do that work. Yeah.
27.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to, I hate to call you Tennessee and Louisiana, but that's how I know to refer to you. But to go back to Tennessee, could you tell us how your superintendent for the recovery district is selected? And then for both of you, if you could tell me, does the 3% carve-out cover that superintendent's salary? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So in Tennessee, the Commissioner of Education hires and fires the superintendent. So they report directly to the commissioner, and the commissioner reports directly to the governor.
So it's like our state school board superintendent?
Correct, yeah. And with the difference being that the commissioner is part of the governor's cabinet in Tennessee. So there's sort of a direct line there. And we don't have the 3% carve-out, though there may be legislation that creates a carve-out for an ongoing funding. In Tennessee, the original costs of the Achievement School District itself, like the school district staff, was funded through Race to the Top. So it's part of Tennessee's Race to the Top program.
2. You passed. Okay. 1.
Chair. This is going to be a Tennessee question. Has there been an economic impact to Memphis because of the designation of an ASD? And secondly, what philanthropic organizations are engaged in Tennessee?
So I'm not aware of an economic impact, and I'm not sure how you would measure it. It's at this point, it's a pretty small percentage of the schools, let alone the overall economy. So I don't see an impact. In terms of philanthropic organizations, with the ASD directly, I'm not even sure if there are any. With the individual charter schools that are part of the ASD that are running schools, they may raise money philanthropically, and many of them do, but it would be from different organizations, and it would be under their own domain.
That gets you. All right. Is that it? Okay, 19.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Last question. Okay.
All right. Quick question, though. Regarding the schools/districts that you've each set up, do you continue or start elective classes, CTAE, fine arts, and those, or is it to where it's mostly academics that you're working on?
That's a good question.
Our goal is to provide an absolutely diverse and rigorous educational experience to every student. And we expect every school to have some base level of that. Now, the one thing you do get in a choice system is schools can specialize, not at the core level, but in their extracurriculars and so forth.
The magnet mentality.
Yeah, exactly. And so some of that's driven by parent demand, too.
Sure.
One thing that happened very quickly after the storm is schools that didn't have Mardi Gras bands suffered in enrollment. And so I think that's a healthy tension. Families and kids are making choices. Schools respond to that. And hopefully over time, parents get the education they deserve.
Thank you.
A question we always get, and we want to ask you, how your children can choose, go anywhere they want to in New Orleans, just move every year. How does your athletic association respond to that? They have to wait out a year to play, or don't want them coming to my school? Are you going to do for that? They answer that quickly. And that's a big problem for us. How do you handle the athletic problem? Children eligible for not even that, band, tennis, whatever. Let's forget football.
So I'm not exactly, we can follow up on this one. I want to make sure I have all the rules right. But it's basically the school you're enrolled in is the part of the entity that your eligibility resides in.
So when you go there, you're eligible immediately for whatever.
I think so, but I'm not positive. And the bigger point here, I think, somebody asked about the neighborhood schools. There's a tension between choice and other values.
Yeah.
And New Orleans has tried to solve that with a compromise. We have 50% of our seats are reserved for some neighborhood. I think every community has to decide what their values are on choice, diversity of school model, athletics, and you can adopt it to your own needs.
Give me some information on that athletic part, because I serve on another committee looking at that, and that's a big issue.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great.
Tennessee, how do y'all handle that, the athletes?
It hasn't been a big issue because we just started taking high schools in, so it hasn't become an issue yet, though.
All right, okay.
Yeah, it's something that I should go back and flag for folks.
As long as he's eligible for the NFL, you may have a Heisman Trophy. I want to take this opportunity to thank y'all. I tell you, this has been, I don't know how you feel, this has been very good. Very good. And I appreciate it. If y'all would just stick around, because I'm sure many of the members want to grab you and ask you a different question. And we many of us have got to get to another meeting.
Thank you.